I've got some good news and some bad news. The good news is we are pretty much done talking about Zucker, Blanchard, and Bailey, and there's the kitty in the cube. The bad news is we're going to instead talk a little bit about Jungian therapy, as well as touch on recovered memories and the parallel that Shrier and others like to make between gender dysphoria and a certain psychological disorder that involves discomfort with one's body and an uncomfortable relationship with food. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to the channel. Let's finish up with these dissidents, shall we? But before that, quick refresher of the visual shorthand to indicate who is talking in these videos. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to the book. And this is for Shrier's couple of references with a smidge of science for me. On with the video. Marchiano, or is it Marchiano? She is the Jungian therapist that Shrier has brought up a couple times before now. When talking about the parents, a thing Marchiano wrote for Aereo magazine was quoted by Shrier. The context there was Shrier arguing that as a society, we have pathologized normal emotions, which then opens the door for these proposed confused teens to misattribute normal teenage angst as gender dysphoria. As discussed in that video, this piece by Marchiano seems to minimize actual psychological issues, like panic attacks, saying instead that people experiencing these have just learned to fall back on the diagnosis instead of bunkering down to deal with the negative state. Super great sort of thing to be hearing from a therapist. In the Shrinks chapter, Marchiano was brought in to say that identities are socially negotiated. This was part of Shrier's claim that social transition cannot easily be undone, counter to the affirming care approach. Her logic was that the people around the trans youth would accept the youth's gender identity and expression, which would then make the youth feel worse because they aren't biologically male. Which flies in the face of many trans and or non-binary people's experience where they aren't supported by the people around them. And according to Shrier's logic, that should have kept them from transitioning in the first place. So later that chapter, Shrier quotes Marchiano from somewhere, citation missing, to say that people who socially transitioned would be stuck in their new identity, lest they lose face. Shrier introduces Marchiano as a Jungian analyst, a social worker, and a widely published author. Any sort of context for this widely published part is not provided. Surprise. But Marchiano was skeptical about the increase in rates of AFAB youth identifying as trans.
She never doubted the distress of the teenage youth claiming gender dysphoria, but as a profound admirer of the power of the unconscious, she was also well aware of the mind's ability to deceive itself. I think the human psyche is very susceptible to these kind of psychic epidemics, she told me. It happened with lobotomies, it happened with multiple personality disorder, it happened in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. Human beings are susceptible to psychic contagion. We just are. Any of us.
Please refer to my Jung video for my general opinion of all that. Granted, the psychodynamic approach has changed since the time of Jung, but I still think a fair number of my criticisms are still valid. Too long didn't watch Bottom Line. Jung's proposed structure of personality and the mind lacks scientific credibility, and I question any therapy built on that foundation. You may have also noted the lack of citation dings there. Shrier has a source, directly. So while the claims are fundamental what the fuckery, she has a source. Going from lobotomies to what is now referred to as dissociative identity disorder, or DID, to what happened in Germany absolutely confuses what she's meaning by psychic epidemics. How are lobotomies a psychic epidemic? On the parts of the doctors doing the procedure? Because it almost certainly wasn't the patients themselves asking for it. And Shrier could have applied this quote in that way, given her stance that affirming care professionals are buying the trans agenda. But she doesn't. Not sure why, but whatever. Don't need to give her ideas. I keep sidestepping this topic and am going to continue to do so, at least for the time being. But Shrier and others fighting the same fight regularly liken teens identifying as trans and or non-binary to people with DID. I will say that putting gender dysphoria in the same psychological disorder bin as the personality disorders or the dissociative disorders is just dropping any pretense of nuance. At a broad enough perspective, there is overlap between the different psych disorders. I mean, the person is having disordered thoughts or behaviors on some level, but the differences between the psych disorders are important and shouldn't be glossed over in this way. Although doing so does go with the narrative that everybody just needs to get better at coping with life. Effective medical treatments be damned, I guess. But then she brings up World War II era Germany. Do I need to go into why what happened in Germany shouldn't be boiled down to a psychic epidemic? I'm having to presume with regard to the Jewish, Romani, gay, trans, and other people killed in the camps. Doing a quick search on Marchiano, and it seems like these arguments line up with a paper she published a couple years ago. Interestingly, in this quarterly journal of Jungian thought, Marchiano's claims received pushback in a subsequent issue. From that abstract, in Outbreak on Transgender Teens and Psychic Epidemics, Lisa Marchiano discusses a purported social contagion called rapid onset gender dysphoria. Her article ignores substantial current research on the outcomes of transition for transgender adolescents and young adults. It further portrays gender dysphoria in adolescence as a psychic epidemic rather than a legitimate medical condition, urging parents to encourage their transgender children to accept their assigned gender, an approach that has already been abandoned in the consensus standard of care because of the documented harm it causes. How do I know that Shrier is only trying to use Marchiano's quote to support the idea that trans youth today are mentally catching the trans?
When we feel psychological distress, she says, we want to explain it in a way that will prompt others to take it seriously. So if you manifest distress in some novel way that no one's ever heard of before, the likelihood is you're going to be dismissed. But if it fits into a prescribed narrative, the unconscious latches onto that. It has explanatory value for you, and you receive care and attention.
Want to ding. But this is nestled in Marchiano's opinion. So, Since manifest is part of this quote, it's probably safe to assume this is manifestation in the Jungian sense. This basically means that stuff floating around in your unconscious is impacting your conscious experience. In this book's framing of trans youth, this would mean that what Shrier has called teenage angst would be the general unformed stuff in the background, and, can't emphasize this enough, in Shrier's framework, this would manifest as hysteria, an eating disorder, DID, or gender dysphoria. To be clear, I'm not buying this argument. I'm not sure if this theory is arguing that all psych disorders are this unconscious stuff being molded into the different culturally acceptable definitions of psych disorders, or if it allows for some psych disorders that we have some biological understanding of, like anxiety, mood disorders, schizophrenia, to exist, and then other people having this unformed unconscious stuff fitting into that. I'm not sure where it is on that. But this idea that general unconscious distress will shape itself to fit cultural narratives of permissible distress needs substantiation, especially as our understanding of what is driving a lot of these psychological disorders improves, neurologically to genetically. Granted, what we call the different combinations of symptoms is somewhat arbitrary, as is where the boundary lies between different related conditions. But this doesn't mean that somebody would say anxiety has an unconscious tangle that's rising up to the conscious and fitting itself to fit what we understand anxiety to be. That's adding a layer of complexity for no reason. But this is exactly what Shrier says is happening.
Patients are drawn to symptom pools, lists of culturally acceptable ways of manifesting distress that leads to recognized diagnoses. Patients unconsciously endeavor to produce symptoms that will correspond to the medical diagnostics of the time. Because the patient is unconsciously striving for recognition and legitimization of internal distress, his or her subconscious will be drawn towards those symptoms that will achieve those ends. Many social contagions are spread this way.
Let's employ Occam's razor here. If you're not familiar, this is a rough heuristic in science where you have a couple explanations for something that's happening, The explanation that has the smallest number of assumptions and fiddly bits is preferable. This Jung-ish explanation for psychological disorders posits that there is unconscious distress that has to pass through a cultural lens, which then causes the person to unintentionally and unconsciously exhibit the symptoms of some known diagnosis. Alternately, the person could have a psychological disorder, which means they are experiencing the symptoms directly, which results in a diagnosis best fitting the symptoms they are presenting with. This second explanation doesn't require the Jung-proposed mind structure or further explanation for why this unconscious distress doesn't manifest in a priori predictable ways. It's also a better fit for all the neurological differences associated with many of the psychological disorders, as it doesn't require further elaboration for why someone with a psychological disorder has differences in their brain given the proposed unconscious nature of the problem. For completeness, references 13 and 14 are both to the book Crazy Like Us, The Globalization of the American Psyche. This book was referenced for a similar argument in this book's introduction. I was fairly charitable with the first referencing, as I was just working off the book's summary. But having gotten my hands on the book, and seeing the psychoanalytic emphasis it has, and as discussed in the intro video, there is the need to consider the cultural context the person with the disordered, dysfunctional, and deviant behaviors exists in. It can impact whether certain behaviors are considered psychological disorders or not. It can also shape, to some extent, how these symptoms present. But I'm not buying this argument that it's a Jungian Play-Doh press, squishing out vague, unconscious distress into distinct disorders. Shrier talks about one of the examples from Crazy Like Us, the apparent emergence of anorexia in Hong Kong in the 90s.
Hong Kong, for instance, had never experienced an epidemic of what Westerners call anorexia, girls captivated by the belief that they are fat, engaging in self-starving. Not until 1994, that is, when local media widely publicized the story of a girl whose tragic death was interpreted by news outlets as an example of an unfamiliar Western ailment called anorexia nervosa. An outbreak of girls presenting with symptoms soon followed. It wasn't that no one in Hong Kong had ever thought to starve themselves before 1994. It was simply that only when anorexia became a culturally agreed-upon expression of internal distress did it become widespread.
Reference 16 is the same book. The thing is, in digging into this a little, it doesn't seem like it was a general internal distress manifesting as anorexia. Instead, it seemed like Hong Kong essentially imported Western beauty standards, and so the youth started feeling that external pressure to adhere to those beauty standards, and then experienced a shift towards more anorexic thoughts and behaviors. A different explanation I found while editing, which may explain all of this a lot better, is that the rise in eating disorders may be linked to growth in industrialization and urbanization in these countries, which just happens to coincide with the influx of Western stuff. In either case, it seems less like a psychic contagion leading to a shift in how internal distress manifests. Also, this idea that anorexia is only seen in girls is harmful. It's seen more often in girls and women, but it can also be seen in boys, men, and non-binary people. Shrier argues that gender dysphoria is now in the symptom pool and shapes how we interpret kids playing around in their parents' clothes.
Our early 21st century symptom pool includes the notion that children can suffer extreme distress as a result of being born in the wrong body, Marchiano wrote. Once gender dysphoria entered the symptom pool by way of a few highly publicized cases, lo and behold, parents, therapists, and doctors began seeing much, much more of it.
Reference 17 is a chapter by Marchiano in the book Transgender Children and Young People, Born in Your Own Body. Gee, wonder what the main point of that book could possibly be. To repeat myself for the nth time, being born in the wrong body is just a quick shorthand representation of the much more complex experience of being trans and or non-binary. To attack that as a point of contention is strawmanning. Children can experience distress matching the diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria, and it's probably not because of some vague unconscious distress mapping onto those symptoms, but because they're actually experiencing gender dysphoria. Repeating myself further, It seems more likely, after listening to people who've gone through this, that the apparent rise in cases is probably due to greater access and ability to talk about what they're experiencing, not this top-down explanation Shrier by way of Marchiano is putting forward. Brace yourselves.
A lone sympathizer with parents facing the predicament of suddenly trans-identifying teens, Marchiano began counseling them in 2016. She avoids conversion therapy bans by not seeing adolescents. Very often, parents have told me she is the only therapist they could find who didn't insist they immediately affirm their child's self-diagnosis.
Wow, Shrier could have worded this differently. Avoids conversion therapy bans by not seeing adolescents basically says Marchiano's doing conversion therapy, which, yeah, from the sounds of it, but still. However, let us not gloss over this recurring detail. Marchiano and Shrier are focusing on the parents who are surprised by their kid identifying as trans and or non-binary. Marchiano describes the premise of therapy as exploration, and that gender-affirming care is the opposite of that, because somebody will come in saying that they have gender dysphoria and then doesn't want to explore any further than that. Genuine therapy should make clients question their own self-assessments. Marchiano's Jungian background is on full display here. My understanding for this type of therapy is the therapist is trying to dig around in the person's unconscious, looking for these psychic tangles that are the root cause of the different problems they're experiencing. A client's self-diagnosis would probably be viewed as incorrect because they don't have the training or the perspective to understand their unconscious mind. This not Jungian psychologist is a bit uncomfortable hearing that this type of therapy should be making a person question themselves, as it sounds kind of like gaslighting. Shrier notes that Marchiano's approach doesn't immediately exclude the possibility that the person actually has gender dysphoria. It's just that it doesn't stop at the person having that.
Patients claiming gender dysphoria, she says, ought to be treated according to the same therapeutic principles as any other troubled patients. When someone walks in and says, "I think I want to leave my marriage, that's why I'm here," I don't know what's going on. We have to listen and find out, and the way I work, that could take months of listening. This idea that a kid's going to come in and tell us that they're trans, and that within a session or 2 or 3 or 4, that we're going to say, "Yep, you're trans, let me write you a letter." That's not therapy.
This actually captures part of why I have a low opinion of the Jungian therapeutic approach. When working from this approach, the therapist can't really take what the client's saying at face value. Doing so is practically anathema. No, they need to spend weeks, if not months to years, working with the client to get into their unconscious and what the true source of their problem is. If someone seeing a therapist wants to get divorced and talk to their therapist about it, it's worthwhile hearing what they have to say. And there could very well be things going on in the relationship that they aren't overtly aware of, and helping them understand these different characteristics or patterns of behavior could maybe help mend that relationship, or at least help them in future ones. But wanting to get divorced is in a different ballpark, if not an entirely different sport, than the psychological disorders. For the psychological disorders, there are fucking standardized tests and diagnostic criteria. These are designed to be relatively quick to administer or interpret, so the client doesn't have to spend all the time and money getting past the diagnostic phase of treatment. So a kid could come in, say they're experiencing gender dysphoria, get screened, and bam, on to treatment. But we're flipping between gender dysphoria, the disorder, and a trans and or non-binary gender identity. Because I haven't repeated myself enough already, someone can be trans and or non-binary and not experience gender dysphoria. If a kid says they're trans, guess what? They're trans. But if a trans youth is being brought to Marchiano for treatment, I guess it's likely due to the parents' distress at having a trans child rather than the distress the child's experiencing themselves. This is echoing something we saw from Zucker's approach, though. The idea that treatment can't stop at a gender dysphoria diagnosis or trans identity. No. Therapy must focus on the root cause of this. And then that started edging towards conversion therapy territory, as the person can then be fixed and accept the body and gender they were born into. Retreading familiar ground, Marchiano thinks that talking about suicide statistics with unsupportive parents is emotional blackmail, with the new added wrinkle that this also adds suicidality into the symptom pool. It can't be that the trans and or non-binary population would have reason to have a higher suicide risk than the other population. Different life experiences, social contexts, family, and society that may not accept them for who they are? No, it can't be any of those things. It's just an idea that was put into their head and has no tangible link to reality. I don't think most things from Peterson's work and 12 Rules or Beyond Order can make me nearly as mad as just half the shit in this book. Shrier gives Marchiano the Rolling Stone interview treatment. They met at a vegan restaurant, blah blah blah. Shrier indicates that she's spoken to hundreds of parents whose kids suddenly identified as transgender. So much of this is writing on the parents' ability to be 100% accurate on what's going on with their kids and in their kids' heads. But as we've previously discussed, and has been demonstrated in this very book, that doesn't seem to be the case. Marchiano claims that a trans identity is like gaining independence as a teenager with extra credit. To quote, "I'm so different from my mom that I'm not even female." If this truly was the case, I would have identified as trans back in middle school. But nope, cis woman, always have been. Shrier reiterates the idea that today's youth are fragile little snowflakes who can't handle negative fifis, adding that they are just gaming the system to get out of the hard parts of life. Has Shrier not been paying attention? Being a teen today seems like a completely different experience to being a teen in the 90s. We practically had it on easy mode with everything that's happened just in the past couple years. Apparently, having a Jungian foundation imbues the therapist with the ability to know what other people are thinking, as Marchiano says that therapists can't entertain the possibility that gender-affirming care is a mistake, as that would make them complicit in something truly awful. The same goes for parents. Hey bestie, how about you flip that sentiment back on yourself, huh? Thanks, bestie. McHugh has only shown up once before in this book, as a reference in the intro. Specifically, his book covering his perspective on the growth and decline of the recovered memory phenomenon. And, dear patrons, the videos on that topic are still a work in progress. It's a heavy topic, and I'm expecting to be cancelled for it, so it's taking a bit. In all honesty, my Suffer Bust 2 video was, in part, after hitting an emotional wall while trying to work on that. Because I read McHugh's book and it sounded interesting, and then I looked him up for more detail. McHugh is a psychiatry professor at Johns Hopkins. Cool. In the book Shrier referenced, he talked about what led him away from a Freudian approach and into a more empirically grounded one. Also cool. As per his wiki page, he is a vocal proponent of Catholic-informed and socially conservative stances relating to sexual orientation and transgender people. Some scientists accuse McHugh of misrepresenting scientific research relating to sexual orientation. Fuck. Johns Hopkins closed its gender clinic and stopped gender-confirming surgeries under his watch, as he believes the surgery should not be done because it's enabling people's disorders. That linked op-ed is 1,000% yikes. I could go on, but you probably get the idea. Basically, it's not surprising that he would end up as one of Shrier's dissidents.
By this point, you may be wondering, what is gender dysphoria? Yes, it's a feeling of profound and persistent discomfort with one's body, but that simply restates the question. Surely psychiatry has more to offer than the DSM's list of symptoms, which amount to this. Gender distress is distress about gender.
Hey Shrier? How about you check earlier in your book? She defined gender dysphoria in a less strawman-y way in the intro, albeit from an outdated version of the DSM. And in the chapter covering Lippmann's proposed rapid onset gender dysphoria, Shrier listed the diagnostic criteria from the current version of the DSM for gender dysphoria in children. While gender dysphoria can be recursively defined as dysphoria or distress about one's gender, Acting like there isn't more depth here is disingenuous. If you watched my video on the DSM, you may recall that one of the criticisms of the DSM is this BuzzFeed quiz-ish nature of the diagnostic criteria. If you're able to check so many boxes, you get the diagnosis. This means that the DSM is primarily focused on the symptoms associated with the different disorders, not what the underlying cause is. And if we're talking about treatment options, understanding the cause can be really helpful. So there certainly is room to criticize the DSM, well beyond this one point, but that's not where Shrier's going with this. Reference 18 is disappointing. It's basically a puff piece she wrote about McHugh. Read it if you want more psychiatry hot takes.
Gender dysphoria is an overvalued idea or ruling passion. This is an idea held by many people in the world, but held intensely by the patient or the person who is making a life of that idea, Dr. McHugh told me. Many people believe that it's good to be thin, for instance. Many AFAB youth believe it's better to be a boy. But for anorexics and those with gender dysphoria, those ideas become all-consuming.
The hot take party just does not stop with him. I'm not sure if it's Shrier or McHugh who is saying that these adolescents believe it's better to be a boy. We can fill in from the book's context that Shrier is using better to mean the perception that life would be easier in a masculine gender, and they wouldn't have to deal with the female puberty and all of that. Even though that isn't really what's going on with gender dysphoria. But there's this mangled analogy between anorexia and gender dysphoria again. In both cases, the person wants to change their body in some way. Sure. But the nature, cause, and treatment of these disorders is different. Shrier emphasizes that McHugh also believes that people with gender dysphoria are experiencing real distress, but that they don't really understand the true source of their distress. Going back to anorexia, Shrier says that people will starve themselves in the false belief that once they are thin enough, they'll be happy. But thin enough will never be an attainable goal, so they'll never be happy, which means that their weight wasn't the real problem. McHugh frames gender dysphoria in the same way. The person is chasing a body that they can't have, and so they will never be happy. As such, they need to come to terms with the body that they do have. Reference 19 is that op-ed from McHugh I mentioned earlier. I've been trying to think how to word my sense that comparing gender dysphoria to anorexia isn't an appropriate comparison to make, and I think I might have it. In anorexia, the person feels that they are too fat or need to not gain more weight. This causes them distress, so they engage in behaviors to get or keep their weight down. Weight itself is an observable trait, although part of anorexia is the disordered sense of body mass. In Western culture, people of different weights can be viewed and treated differently, but it's typically more on the order of microaggressions or even outright aggressions. It's not really used as an identifier. Like, it's not one of the categories in most government forms or a type of bathroom that you use. So the disorder is linked to the person's sense of their body, possibly in part due to exogenous cultural norms of attractiveness. But their ideal body is frequently one that is hazardous to their health, so interventions to get the person out of the disordered eating headspace are used. In gender dysphoria, the person feels that the gender they've been assigned based on their anatomy at birth doesn't match their sense of self. Primary sex characteristics are observable with consent, but gender is far more complex and may not correlate perfectly. In the West, gender officially matters. Government and medical forms, to bathrooms, all the way down to people being shitty to you. Gendered pronouns are a neutral part of language. Pronouns based on weight aren't. Adjectives about a person's weight are frequently rude. Gender dysphoria can be experienced by trans and or non-binary people, but is not required for those identities. Gender dysphoria is also linked to the person's sense of their body, but it's more about the endogenous sense of their gender. Their ideal body is not overtly hazardous to their health, so treatment focuses on bringing the social and physical self in alignment with their sense of self. So a distinction is where the disorder is. In anorexia, the disordered, distressed, and dysfunctional thoughts and behaviors are in the person's relation to their body and food. In gender dysphoria, the key feature is distress at the gender the person's been assigned. Dysfunction may come out of that as, for example, the person may limit social engagement due to their discomfort. Hopefully that was helpful and not more confusing. Shrier likes to play up how these guys are true mavericks. Note the doctor always accompanying McHugh in these passages.
For decades, Dr. McHugh was psychiatry's most prominent scourge. In 1979, as psychiatrist-in-chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital, Dr. McHugh shut down the Gender Identity Clinic, which performed sex change operations. In his view, the hospital had wasted scientific and technical resources and damaged our professional credibility by collaborating with madness rather than trying to study, cure, and ultimately prevent it.
Reference 20 is a piece McHugh wrote for First Things. First Things is America's most influential journal of religion and public life. For somebody who considers himself the voice of reason and empiricism, this piece in a religious journal puts some of Bailey's writing in The Man Who Would Be Queen to shame. McHugh is a hot take god. We're talking galactic level. Seeing as how Johns Hopkins reopened the gender clinic in 2017, it would seem that the credibility damage was done by McHugh, especially with language that indicates a transgender and/or non-binary identity is something to be prevented. Shrier notes that McHugh's opinion on gender-confirming surgery is controversial among the other guys we've talked about in this chapter, as they think that gender-confirming surgery can be appropriate for some people at least. McHugh's problem with it is that you can't predict who's going to have negative outcomes from the surgeries, so nobody should have them. He's gonna light my state on fire with all these hot takes. Shrier gives McHugh the Rolling Stone interview treatment. His house, he's smarty smart, etc., etc. She mentions his involvement with DID and recovered memories as he thinks the current transgender craze is also somewhat iatrogenic. He argues that gender-affirming surgeries are experimental, as there aren't high-quality studies supporting them. I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm not sure about the publication norms for surgeries and procedures and stuff. I'm sure it exists, especially for new or unique surgeries, so I can't really speak to the quality of the research being done on gender-confirming surgeries. I've been told that there are more surgeons doing bottom surgery for trans women than for trans men, although maybe that'll change in the future, and maybe some breakthroughs will come that will make bottom surgery for trans men more enticing. At the moment, it's easier to go whoop than it is to go whoop, and so that is probably factoring into things. So we're just going to file that last point in the hot take box, because it's my video and I can file things as I see fit. But arguing that a transgender identity is, at least in part, encouraged by psychiatrists? Come on. Shrier seems to disagree somewhat, as she says that the current epidemic is different from the previous psychiatric crazes, as the youth are self-diagnosing, and that means that the therapists aren't driving it as much. Gotta keep coming back to that point. But I guess it is a core part of her argument. But here's the thing. We're at a novel point in human civilization. Thanks to the internet, we have an unprecedented level of access to just so much knowledge. A little bit of everything, all of the time. Yeah, consulting Dr. Google can sometimes lead people astray. WebMD saying everybody has cancer is a meme for a reason. But in an increasingly hostile healthcare system, where it seems like you're lucky if you get 15 minutes with a doctor who gives a shit, coming in with some possibilities for what's going wrong with your body is helpful, if not mandatory. The Mayo Clinic website has a preparing for your appointment section for most things. I think in part to help people get the most out of their appointments and be an effective self-advocate. And for something like gender dysphoria, which has been kept behind the medical professional gates for decades, the internet may be the most accessible help that a person can get, especially if they're in an unsupportive family situation. McHugh predicts that the transgender craze will end in the courtroom, with former patients suing their doctors. Specifically, trans youth who receive hormonal or surgical treatment growing into adults who regret having those treatments, hence the lawsuits. As we talked about previously, the vast majority of youth receiving treatment are not going through these more permanent procedures. Puberty blockers while youth figures things out is not going to cause the lasting features McHugh lists. And while it is highly unfortunate for the people who've gone through the more extensive procedures and later regret it, that rate seems to be on par, if not lower, than for other surgical procedures. Shrier wraps up this chapter by playing up the faddishness of trans youth.
Of course, even if this transgender epidemic does represent yet another psychic craze, that doesn't explain why this. So many crazes have come and gone. Serial killing is vanishingly rare. Mass shootings on the rise. Bulimia may be in decline, while cutting and suicide sharply spike. Other fads died off, while this one took root. Why? What's in the national drinking water?
Which is it, Shrier? Is it a craze? Or is it more long-lived and ongoing, and so not a craze? Throughout this book, she's emphasized how new and unusual AFAB trans or non-binary youth are, but this paragraph makes it seem like it's not a flash-in-the-pan affair. Also, I can't believe I'm saying this, but serial killers are driven by a different motive than mass killers, and serial killers have not gone away. And on that note, that's it for the Dissidents. Yay! It's all downhill from here. Yay. Not that we were ever really uphill to begin with in this book, but, you know. Anyways, until next time, bye.